The Viking Age, widely recognized as one of the most chaotic and terrible times in European history, began in the late 8th century and lasted over 3 centuries, until the mid-11th century. During this time, the Vikings, mariners, explorers, and warriors from Scandinavia made an unmistakable impression on the world. However, underneath the splendor of their longships and tales of expedition lied a darker, bloodier reality. The Vikings, known not only for their fierce spirit, but also for their cruel ways, instilled terror in the places they invaded, instituting practices and penalties that continue to shock us.
Blood Eagle, the ultimate execution ritual. The Vikings, known for their violent raids and unwavering warrior spirit, are frequently associated with the most barbaric types of battle and punishment. Among these, one act of execution stands out for its pure horror: the mythical Blood Eagle, which is thought to be one of the most torturous deaths. The Blood Eagle was more than just an execution method. It was a ritualized display of retribution, vengeance, and possibly sacred sacrifice. While many stories of Viking ferocity are based on both truth and fiction, the Blood Eagle remains one of the most contentious and horrific descriptions of Viking lore. The Blood Eagle, as depicted in medieval sagas, involved a painful process. The victim's back was slashed open, revealing the ribs, which were then carefully fractured and dragged outward. The lungs were then dragged out through the back to make the shape of wings, completing a horrible transformation meant to resemble a bird, hence the name Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle accounts are graphic in nature, depicting tremendous physical agony and suffering. According to the sagas, the Blood Eagle was executed in a careful succession of procedures, each calculated to increase the victim's anguish and the audience's response. First, the victim was restrained, likely kneeling or lying face down, leaving them fully defenseless. With a keen blade, the executioner would make a lengthy incision down the victim's back, slashing away skin and muscle to reveal the ribs. The ribs were then separated from the spine one by one, an operation that required both strength and precision. Each rib was separated and dragged outward, forming the ghastly wings that gave the ceremony its name. The next process was possibly the most horrific. The lungs were dragged out through the rib holes and draped across the shoulders, completing the likeness to an eagle's wings. According to some stories, the victim was still alive at this point, gasping for breath as their lungs were exposed to the air. This execution ritual's intense suffering and horrific visuals would have left an indelible physical and psychological impression on those who experienced it. The Blood Eagle is a notorious figure in Viking lore, although historians and researchers continue to argue its veracity. The Blood Eagle is mostly described in Norse sagas like Orkneyinga saga and Norna Geststhatter, which tell stories of Viking heroes, monarchs, and warriors. However, these documents were written centuries after the events they describe, and they frequently contain embellishments that reflect the narrative practices of the time. In the 13th century, 2 Icelandic authors, Snorri Sturluson and the anonymous authors of the Saga of the Sons of Ragnar, chronicled instances of the Blood Eagle, depicting it as a type of ritualized vengeance for mistreated family members or slain soldiers. However, by this point, much of Viking history had already become legend, with exaggerated or even fictional details inserted to heighten the drama of the sagas. The Blood Eagle, as depicted in these texts, could thus be the result of literary imagination rather than a historically genuine practice. The testimonies of specific persons who reportedly underwent the Blood Eagle ritual provide the most compelling evidence for its historicity. The Blood Eagle was said to have been performed on Ella, a Northumbrian monarch who had captured and executed Viking hero Ragnar Lothbrok. The epic states that Ragnar's sons avenged their father by submitting Ella to the Blood Eagle, a suitable punishment for a monarch who had showed no pity to the Vikings. Even in this case, there is little corroborating evidence outside of the sagas to support the account. Furthermore, the physical mechanics of the Blood Eagle create further concerns. Many experts have questioned whether such a ceremony could be performed
without the victim dying from shock or blood loss throughout the process. The Vikings were skilled warriors with a thorough understanding of the human body, but their capacity to keep someone alive long enough to perform the blood eagle as described is exceedingly doubtful. Some academics believe that the blood eagle was a symbolic description of mutilating a corpse rather than an actual execution procedure used on a living person. The blood eagle's primary function may have been psychological warfare. The Vikings were notorious for their psychological techniques. They recognized that terror could be as powerful a weapon as any blade. The Vikings terrified their foes by disseminating stories of the blood eagle and other horrible penalties, discouraging revolt and resistance. If an enemy is encouraged to believe that capture will result in such a fate, they may be more likely to surrender or avoid battle entirely. Whether the blood eagle was an actual historical practice or a fabrication of Viking legend, its legacy lives on. Going a Viking. Going a Viking was a practice that embodied the spirit of raiding, exploration, and conquering. Going Viking wasn't only a term for fighting to the Norse, it was a way of life and a social institution based on necessity and tradition. By becoming a Viking, the Norse could travel beyond their borders to obtain resources that were either rare or completely inaccessible at home. Precious metals, textiles, animals, and slaves were greatly sought for, and raiding expeditions became a viable means of obtaining these items. Viking raids were usually quick, ferocious, and thoroughly prepared. The decision to raid was not made at random, but rather based on possible targets' riches, defensibility, and closeness to the sea. Smaller villages and coastal monasteries, which were wealthy but had few defenses, were frequently targeted. These targets were frequently defenseless, with their residents unprepared for physical combat. For the Vikings, such raids were low risk and big return, yielding treasures and slaves with little resistance. The psychological consequences of the Lindisfarne invasion went far beyond the obvious devastation. This single attack sent shockwaves throughout Europe, where monasteries and churches had historically served as places of sanctuary, away from the horrors of the outer world. The Vikings' invasion damaged people's sense of security, leaving them fearful and anticipating future raids. Viking assaults were particularly horrifying because to their seeming randomness, mercilessness, and frequent targeting of sacred or vulnerable areas. Unlike organized armies, Vikings were unpredictable. They could appear on any given day, cause havoc, and then vanish across the water. The element of surprise was a key Viking strategy. By assaulting without warning, they gave settlements little time to plan or organize a defense. Viking raids struck quickly, giving the idea that they could arrive out of nowhere, posing a constant and unstoppable danger. They would approach at dawn or dusk, when visibility was low, and use their knowledge of tides and beaches. Their subtlety was their weapon, and their purpose was not just to seize wealth, but also to inspire fear in those who observed or heard about their attacks. Monasteries became especially vulnerable because they housed rich valuables like golden crosses, glittering chalices, and illustrated manuscripts. More significantly, monasteries were frequently secluded, with little defense other than the monks themselves, who were mostly inexperienced in combat. The Vikings recognized that assaulting religious sites would send a powerful statement, displaying their contempt for local beliefs and institutions, while also generating riches. The symbolic aspect of these raids highlighted the Vikings' foreignness. They were unearthly invaders who ignored the sanctity of Christian sites, heightening the tragedy of their crimes. In the imaginations of many Europeans, the Vikings represented ruin and death. Legends and rumors about Viking violence spread quickly, with each recounting exaggerating the savagery. Viking chiefs recognized that this notoriety would make prospective targets more likely to surrender or escape at the sight of their ships, reducing any resistance they might face. Fear, in this sense, became a weapon as formidable as a sword or an axe, demoralizing potential victims before the first stroke was delivered. To reinforce their scary image, Vikings frequently displayed the savagery of their acts. Survivors were purposefully allowed to tell stories of Viking cruelty, ensuring that others learned of the devastation. In some cases, the Vikings left bodies unburied, dangling from trees or strewn over fields as a terrifying warning to those who may challenge them. This was a deliberate demonstration, a warning that resistance would end in death or servitude. Punishments: maiming, banishment, and mutilation. The Vikings had a variety of punishments at their disposal, depending on the gravity of the offense. For minor offenses, fines and restitution, known as vergild or man price, were usually required. This payment paid the victim or their family for loss or injury, with the amount varying according to the offense, the harm done, and the social status of those involved. However, for more significant crimes, the Vikings used harsher kinds of punishment, which frequently included bodily pain, banishment, or, in extreme circumstances, death. Maiming was a prevalent form of punishment. Mutilation could be used as a deterrent in cases of stealing. Thieves' hands or fingers may be severed, indicating that they are no longer able to steal or utilize their trade tools. Other punishments included branding, which entailed burning a mark into the offender's skin to represent their crime, making it impossible for them to conceal their actions. Branding was a very effective deterrent, since it left a permanent stigma, identifying the individual as a criminal wherever they went. Mutilation was another extremely harsh method of punishment. If someone commits a very serious offense, such as insulting another family's honor or indulging in treachery, they may face limb or ear amputation, eye removal, or other forms of body mutilation. For the most serious crimes, like as murder, incest, or oath-breaking, the punishment was frequently outlawry, exile from society. Being proclaimed an outlaw in Viking civilization was a severe punishment that effectively rendered the individual defenseless and devoid of all legal protection. Anyone could kill an outlaw without consequences. They had no rights or assistance from the community. Outlawry was thus a death sentence in all but name, as few outlaws survived long without the help and protection of a clan or kin. Holmgang, trial by combat. One of the more unusual parts of Viking justice was the use of holmgang, or duels, as a form of conflict settlement. The phrase holmgang means going to the small island, as duels were frequently staged on isolated strips of land or in officially designated sites. In a society that placed a high importance on personal honor, holmgang permitted people to settle conflicts through battle and, in some cases, seek vengeance or defend their honor publicly. Holmgang was sometimes the last alternative for resolving feuds, particularly those involving honor or serious grievances like as conflicts over land, property, or marriage. Duels were highly regulated, with laws limiting what weapons might be used and where the fight would take place. Each participant was often accompanied by a shield bearer who provided assistance by holding an extra shield or weapon, but the duel itself was intended to be a test of individual ability, strength, and courage. The structure of a holmgang was meticulous. Combatants would construct a circle around the location where the duel would take place, frequently using cloaks or stones. This circle, known as the holmer, was the limit within which the combat could take place, confining movement and increasing the confrontation. The struggle lasted until one of the participants gave up, became incapacitated, or, in many cases, was slain. In other cases, the holmgang permitted a negotiated solution if one party was clearly outmatched, or the disagreement could be handled without more killing. However, surrendering in a duel typically resulted in the loser having to pay reparations or suffer shame. The Eyrbyggja saga, which describes the conflict between warriors Vermund the Slender and Thorgrim Kjalaksson over a land dispute, features a holmgang. A victory in holmgang might boost a warrior's prestige and maintain his status in the community, but defeat meant not only dishonor, but possibly serious penalties, including death or forced recompense. Gruesome funeral practices. In Viking society, death was viewed as a gateway to another domain, one that reflected the individual's life and accomplishments. Death for Viking leaders, warriors, and other prominent individuals was marked by elaborate burial ceremonies intended to commemorate their heritage and secure their safe passage to the afterlife. Ship burials were among the most famous and iconic of these rituals, ceremonial rites in which the deceased was placed in a vessel, typically a full-size ship, surrounded by their cherished goods, weapons, and, on occasion, friends, to accompany them on their final voyage. One of the most well-known instances of a Viking ship burial is the Oseberg ship, discovered in Norway in 1904 and dating back to roughly 834 CE. This grave featured the remains of two ladies, most likely of noble or royal status, as well as a plethora of objects such as fabrics, sleds, and even the remains of animals like oxen. Although the Oseberg grave contains no evidence of human sacrifice, it clearly depicts the grandeur of elite Viking funerals, in which the departed were sent off with the riches and resources they would require in the afterlife. While ship burials were magnificent and majestic, some Viking funerals took on a darker tone, involving the ritual sacrifice of captives or followers to accompany the departed to the afterlife. This tradition, which is supported by archaeological evidence and historical records, illustrates the cruel side of Viking civilization, where allegiance and servitude lasted beyond death. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Abbasid Caliphate diplomat and 10th century Arab traveller, provides the most vivid and thorough account of this ritual sacrifice. Ibn Fadlan visited the Rus, a people of Norse descent who live along the Volga River, and observed the funeral of a renowned leader. His story is one of the few personal accounts of Viking burial sacrifices, providing a unique insight into this horrible ceremony. According to Ibn Fadlan's report, when a chieftain died, plans were made not only for his burial, but also for the selection of companions to accompany him in death. In this example, a young female slave volunteered or was chosen to die alongside her master, and her participation in the funeral was a somber and ritualistic experience. She was subjected to a series of ceremonies designed to prepare her for the voyage to the afterlife, such as anointing with oils and symbolic wardrobe changes. On the day of the funeral, the chieftain's body was placed aboard a ship surrounded by grave goods, such as food, weapons, and personal belongings. After a lengthy process involving many ceremonies and even sexual acts done by different members of the community, the slave girl was eventually carried to the ship and strangled by the chieftain's family members and elders. The brutal ceremony assured that the chieftain was not alone on his journey, and the slave's sacrifice was thought to improve his position and ensure devotion beyond death. This rite was not just for chieftains. In other cases, animals were sacrificed, reflecting the Vikings' polytheistic beliefs and reverence for Odin, Freya, and other gods. Horses, in particular, were commonly sacrificed in funerals to represent speed and power, allowing the deceased to journey quickly in the afterlife. The sacrifice of slaves or companions was more than just a show of power. It was an offering, a ceremony aimed to bridge the gap between the living and the deceased. This ultimate act of loyalty became a strong symbol, testifying to the society structure and the authority of the person being buried.